Flight assist off.
Hey there folks, Commander Orlando here. So this is going to be a quick video on reading the Thargoid movements and cold orbiting and how you're going to put your thruster inputs into your cold orbits. What I'm actually doing when I'm cold orbiting. Because it's not just a case of using downward thrust the entire time and hoping you go around the Goid. You're going to have to do many micro inputs in order to get a nice stable orbit. So we have a nice volunteer Medusa, and we'll just bring it along for the ride. Come this way. Let's take out this swarm quickly first. And we'll see how long we can keep an orbit going for before we die. Alright, swarm is in ring formation, make it a bit easier to see. And let's go into aim for the outer edges. And miss. Better. As it gets closer, it gets a little easier. I'm basically just aiming along the vector it's headed along at the outer edges. And alright. So everyone has their own way of entering an orbit. I tend to do mine a bit lazier. I usually let the Goid come to me with a nice lazy downward thrust. And we'll do some standard pips. And I'll add a bit of left thrust into it too. I'll just get a nice loop going and let it come to me. Once it gets to near close to 3 kilometers, I'll start pushing into it. So we'll push into it now, some downward, left, and forward thrust into close. And I'll do that until I get to about, I'm just doing forward and up thrust now actually to tighten this orbit, and downward thrust with forward now to close in. And I'd be starting to lay into the Thargoid now, we're starting to close the orbit. So I'm thrusting down now, only down. And thrusting down still. And adding a bit of left thrust with down. And thrusting forward a bit. It's going for a rearm. I'm trying to chase after it now. I need to, if you watch the stars, you'll see my directions going away from the Goid. Downward thrust only now. And forward thrust as well. Keep an eye on the star movements to see how I'm trying to influence it to move parallel to the Thargoid. Down only now with a bit of forward thrust. And reverse thrust down. We have a dead orbit now. So let's see if we can pull out. We're just going to thrust down. And some other inputs as well. Keep an eye on the thrust, the star direction. I was going parallel to it. So now we have a nice direction going now. Let's restart one. Alright. So going back in. Thrusting down now. We have enough forward momentum. There we are. Thrusting forward a bit to close this a bit. There we go. Starting to lay into it now. And thrusting down, down, forward to tighten this loop a bit. If you watch my star trails, I'm starting to go parallel to it, so I want to go down. There we go. We're doing well now. Downward only now. And a bit of forward thrust to bring ourselves back around. Downward only again. Forward into it. Keep an eye on the star trails to see what I'm doing. Downward only and forward at this time. Now we have a direction going that's perpendicular to it. Downward thrust. There we are. Letting it come to me, pulling back a bit. Downward thrust only now, trying to restart this orbit. There we are. It worked. And thrusting forward and down to try to cancel out of this. And left thrust and down at the same time now, trying to work with my movement already. Forward thrust to keep into it, and downward thrust only now. There we are. And forward thrust. And we'll chase after it a bit, but not too much. Okay, now it's going to go for a rearm, and this is the big question. Where is it going to go? Alright, bad one, so let's keep a bit of downward thrust only. There we are, we have a direction going. Forward thrust. Downward thrust. Downward thrust. Forward thrust to tighten this with a bit of left thrust to sort of go with my word. Left and forward and down only now. Left only, trying to work with my movements. Keep an eye on the stars moving now. I'm trying to work with that and make it go perpendicular to the goid. There we are, we've done it. And forward thrusting with left thrust at the moment, trying to get a direction going, but keep in range at the same time. And downward thrusting only, rolling into the downward thrust. There we are, we have a nice orbit going now. Downward thrust, letting it come to me. A bit of forward thrust to change the vector that I have, to keep it perpendicular. Downward thrust only now, and left thrust and down thrust at the same time. And downward thrust only now, a forward thrust to try to change my vector to keep it perpendicular. Downward thrust only, we have a bit of one going. We're at a good range. Downward thrust and forward thrust. I'm trying to keep myself in. There we are, we're perpendicular again. Forward thrust only, upward thrust now actually with forward to try to get myself going forward a bit. And downward thrust only now. And we play the game of, we're guessing where it's going to start its orbit. Good, we're set. We're perpendicular. Downward thrust reversing, it's getting way too close. Forward thrust because our vector is wrong. Let's see if we can pull out without a boost. Alright, so my direction seems to be fine. Downward thrusting only. There we are. We made it. Alright, downward thrust, forward thrust, because it's looping back around now. We need to change our vector, downward thrust and forward thrust. There we go, our vector's changed. It's going in for an attack run, so I'm going to forward thrust again. With a bit of downward thrust, we have a vector going, perpendicular to it, okay. And we play the game of, do I have the right vector now? Okay, we do. It's okay. Perfect. Downward thrusting, we're perpendicular to it. Forward thrusting in, closing that orbit. Downward thrusting, we don't want to get too parallel to it. Downward thrusting only, forward thrusting, and downward thrusting at the same time. And now, we're eating some damage, so I'm going to use a boost. We use them sparingly, but they can restart orbits fairly well. I took some damage there because my heat spiked. The turreted thermal vent beam is not going to cover you in a boost. So now we have the unique situation of having a swarm out and an enraged Thargoid, meaning that swarm is really dangerous right now. We do not want to pass through it, so let's go back in, because we need to get an exert. We're not going to, we're just going to pretend, but... Alright, so pushing forward to close that orbit, downward thrust. I'm going to try to be conscious of where that swarm is and try not to orbit into us. Downward thrust only now. Forward thrusting with downward thrust to try to change my vector. Left thrust at the same time now. Rolling, trying to move away from that swarm now as well with downward thrust. Trying to get a vector going. There we go. We're doing well. Left thrust only now. Forward thrust to try to change my vector. Alright. There we are. And downward thrust only now, forward thrust, we need to close into it, loop back around, forward thrust, downward thrust, and leftward thrust at the same time now. And forward thrust and left at the same time, we're still moving perpendicular to it, left thrust and forward thrust. There we are, we have enough, only left now. And we'll do a bit of downward thrust now, and left thrust at the same time, and down only now. And we're going to do left thrust only now. That swarm's getting too close. I don't like that. It went for a rearm, so I didn't have to boost away from it, thankfully. I'm doing left only now, because the swarm's to my right. Alright, left, and down. We want to get out of that swarm's way. And forward thrust, change our vector down a bit more. There we go, to close that loop. Keep an eye on the stars and how they're moving, and how they're perpendicular to the Thargoid right now. I need a forward thrust to move my vector down more. And left thrust, and downward thrust, and forward thrust. So that's the gist of what we're doing, but to see why this is so dangerous, we've now agitated this swarm, and we have an enraged Thargoid. So it's not going to be a good scene. So let's reestablish this orbit. Because any second, that swarm is going to missile, and it's going to missile all at once. And when they hit, the fight's over. So really, this is all just a case of reading the Goid's movements, keeping an eye on its direction, keeping an eye on your vector, and trying to keep that vector perpendicular as best you can. And you won't be looking at the stars when you're doing this. You'll be getting more of a feel for your movement and saying, my orbit is stalling now. I feel like I'm moving parallel with the Thargoid. You need to be moving perpendicular to it. And you'll roll and move and thrust in different directions to try to counter it in whatever way you can. And that's the main purpose, is simply to counter the movement and stay at a good vector away from its movement so that you're out of that firing cone. But keep on it, it's practice, and you'll get better at it. And for the most part, just have fun with it.